Kill them all! Move forward!
Why you wouldn't survive a Viking siege, the naked and raw reality. Imagine the smell of salt and old seaweed is suddenly replaced by the scent of burning thatch and the iron tents of fresh blood hitting cold mud. You are a terrified villager in 9th century Northumbria, clutching a rusted tool as a shadow larger than any man kicks down your door. The Viking Age wasn't about epic duels. It was a claustrophobic nightmare of screaming, smoke, and the realization that they are here to harvest your life. By the end of this, you'll understand that a Viking siege was a biological and psychological wrecking ball that left no room for survival. The first thing that would kill your chances of survival is the terrifying efficiency of the Viking longship. Unlike a traditional army that clatters with heavy wagons, the Northmen arrived like ghosts. Their ships had such a shallow draft that they could sail right up onto your beach or miles inland through a narrow creek. You wouldn't hear a horn blast. You would hear the rhythmic, wet thud of oars stopping and then the sound of men jumping into the surf. By the time the first house was on fire, it was already too late to run. The Vikings didn't just attack. They bottled the village, sealing the exits before you even realized the sun was up. The tactical shock was so great that most people froze, and in a siege, hesitation is a death sentence. Once the initial panic settles, the reality of the Viking shield wall becomes your next nightmare. This wasn't a static wall of wood. It was a grinding machine of muscle and steel. When they surrounded a fortified manor or a church, they didn't just stand there. They used a tactic called the spin-filking, or the boar snout, a wedge formation designed to shatter your morale and your bones simultaneously. As you stand there with your pitchfork, you aren't looking at a soldier. You are looking at a man who believes that dying in this mud is his ticket to eternal glory. That psychological gap is impossible to bridge. They aren't afraid of your weapons, but you are absolutely terrified of their axes. The sheer physical size of these raiders meant that when the lines met, it felt like being hit by a runaway cart. But the most underrated killer in a Viking siege was the fire. Vikings used fire as a primary weapon of terror. They would throw torches onto the thatched roofs of the houses while the families were still inside. If you'd stayed in, you'd suffocated in the thick, black smoke of burning straw and animal fat. If you ran out, you ran directly onto the points of their spears. There was no middle ground. The air in a besieged village quickly became unbreathable, a toxic mix of soot and the smell of roasting livestock. This wasn't a siege that lasted months. It was a flash siege that burned through a community in less time than it takes for you to finish a meal. The chaos was deliberate, designed to make organized resistance impossible and turn your neighbors into screaming obstacles. If you managed to survive the fire, you now faced the reality of Viking weaponry, which was far more surgical and horrific than the movies suggest. The Viking bearded axe wasn't just for chopping. The hook at the bottom was used to grab the top of your shield and pull it down, exposing your neck to a second attacker. This was a coordinated, practiced choreography of slaughter. Most survivors' accounts speak of the clatter of iron, a sound that haunted them for life. The injuries weren't clean. Viking swords were designed for slashing, creating massive, gaping wounds that wouldn't just kill you, they would leave you screaming in the mud for hours. There were no medics, no bandages, and no mercy. If you couldn't stand, you were finished. Beyond the physical wounds, there was the psychological warfare. You've likely heard of the Blood Eagle. They wanted you to believe they were monsters. They would leave the bodies of the fallen in specific, gruesome displays to ensure that the next village would surrender without a fight. This wasn't just violence. It was a marketing campaign of horror.
Kill them all! Move forward!
Shatter your mind. The culture of the Northmen also meant they had a completely different view of value. While you saw your home and your cattle as your life, they saw them as movable wealth. During a siege, they would systematically strip the village of anything that could be carried. They would take the grain, the silver, and, most tragically, the people. Slavery. The psychological trauma of being treated like livestock, watching a village burn from the deck of a retreating longship, was a fate many considered worse than death. In a Viking siege, surviving often just meant your nightmare was moving to a new location. In many medieval sieges, the local church or monastery was seen as a place of sanctuary. If you lived in the 9th century, this was your greatest mistake. To the Vikings, a church wasn't a house of God. It was a gold-plated treasure chest filled with soft, unarmed targets. They targeted monasteries specifically because they were wealthy and undefended. Imagine the horror of retreating into a stone building, praying for a miracle, only to realize the doors were being barred from the outside. The Vikings would often set the religious buildings on fire, or use them as slaughterhouses to desecrate the local faith. Your prayers wouldn't be answered by a miracle. They would be drowned out by the sound of axes splintering the oak doors. The hygiene and health conditions during and after a siege were just as lethal as the swords. Even a short siege would leave the water supply contaminated. Dead bodies in the wells, offal from slaughtered cattle, and the lack of any waste management meant that even if the Vikings left, the plague stayed behind. Dysentery and camp fever would sweep through the survivors within days. You would be left in a landscape where the infrastructure of life had been systematically destroyed. Without food and clean water, the survivors of a Viking siege often died of starvation or infection within the month. The Northmen didn't just take your gold, they took your ability to exist in that location. Furthermore, the social fabric of your community would be decimated. In a siege, it's every man for himself. You would see your local lord, the man you paid taxes to for protection, fleeing on his horse while you were left to face the axes. The betrayal of the social contract was a heavy psychological blow. You would realize that the order of your world was a lie. This loss of trust made rebuilding almost impossible. You were left in a world that felt empty and cursed. The Vikings didn't just raid. They left a scar on the land and the people that lasted for generations. If you were one of the few to remain in the ruins, you would spend the rest of your life jumping at every sound from the coast, living in a state of permanent, vibrating fear. As the tide rises, and the longships finally disappear into the gray horizon, the silence that follows is the most terrifying part. A Viking siege didn't end with a treaty or a peace ceremony. It ended when there was nothing left to take or kill. You were left in a smoldering graveyard, surrounded by people who are strangers to you now, bonded only by the trauma of what you've just seen. The raw reality is that the Vikings changed the DNA of Europe, not just through conquest, but through this specific, lightning-fast brutality. You wouldn't have survived because you weren't prepared for an enemy that played by a completely different set of rules, one where mercy was a foreign concept. Looking back at these wolves of the sea, it's easy to get lost in the legends of Thor and Odin. But for the person on the ground, the reality was much more about the smell of smoke and the weight of an axe. It makes you realize how fragile our safety really is, and how much we owe to the fact that we don't wake up to the sound of oars on a beach. History isn't just a list of dates. It's the story of people just like you who had the worst day of their lives, and somehow found a way to keep going, or didn't. It's a sobering thought that carries a lot more weight than any costume or TV show can ever portray. I'm genuinely curious, though, if you heard that low, rhythmic thumping of oars coming from the river at dawn, what would be your first move? Would you try to hide in the woods? Or are you the type to grab whatever is nearby and stand your ground? I love reading your survival plans in the comments. If you appreciate this kind of unvarnished, gritty look at the past, I'd love for you to join our community here. We aren't just a channel. We are a group of people who want to feel the heartbeat of history, even when it's racing with fear. Hit that subscribe button and pull up a seat by the fire. We've got a lot more ground to cover together. Tell me your thoughts, share your own family stories of survival, and let's keep this conversation going. I'll see you in the next one, hopefully in a much safer time and place.